data, particularly the GPS. And they didn't really work with the Bluetooth buttons. That has, I think, changed a little bit. Some of the participants then did say, this has been brilliant, and I'm going to go and buy a GoPro, and I'm going to video all my journeys, even if it involves sort of manually looking through the video later, because it will be this proof. And I had at least a couple of people who said that, and that was quite an interesting reflection. And a couple of people did actually say, oh, doing this has given me the confidence to go out and do this, and I'm definitely going to do this in the future. So I thought that was quite interesting. I think there's a lot of potential there for technologies like this, not necessarily this specific technology, but this kind of technology.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Let's thank our speaker. Our third presentation is from Abdullah Ali. He's a PhD student from the University of Washington, presenting Crowdlicit, a system for... Is that something we need to fix?
I think it's just your phone.
It's my phone. Exciting. Okay. He's presenting Crowdlicit, a system for conducting distributed end-user elicitation and identification studies.
That's interesting. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Abdullah Ali. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Washington's Information School. Today, I'm presenting work on behalf of my collaborator, Meredith Ringel-Morris from Microsoft Research, and my advisor, Jake Wobrock from the University of Washington's Information School. The work I'm talking about today is about Crowdlicit, a system for conducting distributed end-user elicitation and identification studies. Just in case not everyone in this room is familiar with what an elicitation study is, I will briefly describe it. An end-user elicitation study is a user-centered interaction design methodology. In 2005, Wobrock et al. Published a study utilizing this method to create user-defined gestures. And then followed up this work in 2009, Wobrock, Morris, and Wilson formalized the methodology in HCI in a CHI paper where they presented a formula for agreement calculations and presented techniques for conflict resolution. Over the last 10 years, this paper has gone to become the 8th most cited paper at CHI with over 1,000 citations, and there is actually over 175 studies published replicating this method. Examples of these studies is this work creating natural human-drone interactions, controlling smart TVs, and creating a interaction language for augmented reality environments. As a matter of fact, at this CHI, apart from this work, there are 5 elicitation studies published, such as Kim and Fulmer's work on swarm robots, and Wang et al.'s work with visually impaired people and how they interact with mobile devices in public spaces. So how does the study actually work? Well, a researcher or a system creator would invite end users to their lab and present them with the effect of an action on that system. This is known as a referent, and then they would ask the participants to propose the action that would trigger that referent, which is known as a symbol. So throughout this talk, you'll hear me talking a lot about reference and symbols. In short, symbols are actions that invoke reference or functions in an interactive system. Then, once the researcher collects all the proposed symbols from their end users, they group them into similar groups, and then the group with the highest similarity, or the symbol with the highest consensus among participants, is selected as a symbol to be implemented in the system. These symbols can take many forms. For example, text like command lines for a command line interface, gestures such as stroke gestures for touch screens, or mid-air gestures for something like a Connect or something like that. They can be audio, like voice commands for intelligent assistants like Siri, or they can be visual, like icons. To give you sort of a concrete visual example of how something like this would run, say I'm designing a new interface and I want to know what the delete icon would look like, I would invite 3 participants and say, draw an icon that, that deletes an item. And my 3 participants would draw these 3 different sketches. When I go to analyze my results, I group these 2 trash can looking ones together because they're similar, and then in my system, I would implement a design of an icon that looks like this because it was the icon that was the most popular. Well, despite the method's popularity, it does have some drawbacks, and in this work we highlight and address 3 of these drawbacks. Number 1 is the diversity and accessibility of these studies. Because they are typically run in a lab environment, only participants who are able and willing to come to your lab are the ones who get to sort of influence the design of future technologies. And there's work like by Reinecke et al. That on in-lab HCI studies versus online ones suggest that in-lab participants usually are weird, which is an acronym actually, stands for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Thank you. And in elicitation studies, typically the number of participants is like only 20 participants. Secondly, when analyzing elicitation studies, to find the groups that are of symbols that are most similar, you essentially have to compare them all to each other. So to get those groups of similar symbols, it requires a lot of time and effort. If anybody in this room has ever done an elicitation study, I'm sure they can relate to this pain. And finally, most elicitation studies out there conclude by reporting a set of user-generated interactions, and the whole process kind of lacks a method of a formalized method to evaluate those results. So to address these drawbacks, we created a system called Crowdlicit, which is an online tool that translates the process of elicitation studies to the web, and we looked over the research and the best practices and extensions to the method and implemented it in that system. So a researcher would log in, create a study, add their reference in, and the Crowdlicit system generates a unique URL that the researcher can then send out to their participants directly and collect symbols from like hundreds or even thousands of people from all over the world. So I did say that most elicitation studies have like 20 participants, and analyzing that is really kind of a pain. So how are we going to handle input from hundreds of people, possibly thousands? Well, it turns out we've already solved this with another system that we created called CrowdCensus that is designed specifically to analyze end-user elicitation studies using crowd workers and machine learning algorithms. We found that the CrowdCensus approach gave results with a similar quality as expert researchers who are analyzing these elicitation studies, but it was 4 times as fast. You can read more about CrowdCensus and the work we did there in our WIS 2018 paper. There is a URL here. It's aka.ms/crowdcensus. Finally, now we have a set of user-driven interactions. That's where all most of the elicitation studies end. How can we verify its fit for the system? Well, in this work, we are proposing the end-user identification study methodology. Essentially, it is the reverse of an elicitation study, where we show the participants an action or an input, a symbol essentially, and then ask them to propose the referent and find the referent with the highest consensus from our users. So going back to our example, this is the icon that resulted from our elicitation study. We would recruit new users and ask them what function would be triggered by this icon, and then find the function with the highest consensus and see if that matches. We can also use Crowdlicit and CrowdCensus to run an identification study as well. So in this work, to put up Crowdlicit through its paces, we did an online elicitation study based on Morris's 2012 Web on the Wall. And in that study, we had 15 referents, which were web browser commands. We recruited 78 participants from Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And we ended up, after analyzing it, with 15 symbols that happened to be voice commands to control the web browser. 9 of those were reported in Morris's original set from her 2012 paper, and 6 were brand new ones. To see how well that set we generated from the Crowdlicit study was, we conducted an identification study where we had 49 symbols in total. 43 from Morris's original that included the 9 we had in common and the 6 new ones. And we recruited 24 new participants from Mechanical Turk. And when we analyzed the results, we saw that 38 out of Morris's 43 were identified correctly, and Crowdlicit's entire set was identified correctly. And when we compared the agreement, the referent agreement scores between the 2 sets, we found that the Crowdlicit one had significantly higher scores than Morris's. In both of our studies, both the elicitation study and the identification study, we had our participants fill out a usability survey to assess how their experience was with the Crowdlicit interface, and we got really well positive results from our participants. I can refer you to the paper for the full breakdown of these results. So who can use this? Well, we put both Crowdlicit and CrowdSenses in one platform called the Crowd Design Engine, where researchers, industry practitioners, or any system creators can go on and do an elicitation study in Crowdlicit and then directly port their results into CrowdSenses and utilize online crowds and machine learning to analyze the results really fast. And that can happen in a matter of days or even hours. So if you go to crowddesignengine.com, to this URL with 1D, there you'll find a guide that will take you through the process of how to use these systems. And if you've never done an elicitation study before, ever, and you want to learn, the site also has a guide that teaches you the basics of the method, lists essential papers in the area that you should read as well, and how to use both systems. I would like to thank Microsoft Research, the Manny Charitable Foundation, and the National Science Foundation, and the Information School at University of Washington for their support of this work. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So we have a remarkable 8 minutes for questions, which means you have plenty of time to visit the website, test it out for a little bit, and then ask questions about the website even, I'm sure.
Okay, you can run study and get back.
Hi. Thanks for the interesting talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering, I couldn't completely remember the definition of what a referent is. Does a referent necessarily need an output? Or can it also be, for example, a haptic feedback that you receive without it actually changing something in the interface?
So a referent is anything that a computer does or a device does. So how you represent it is up to you. In the system, you can put reference in many different forms. So you can show a video of your device doing something, or you can have text description, an audio clip, or an image between two states of a before and after. So that's as far as a referent goes.
Right. So would then would creating haptic sensations that you receive during an interaction, would those be considered as, could you classify those within an elicitation study? Could you have those elicited by or does it not completely classify?
Definitely, you can do that. That would be fit for an in-lab elicitation study, but you can still use the system to organize your whatever input you're collecting from the users. But in an elicitation study, you can definitely show a referent as vibrations coming out of a device or something like that.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, great talk.
Thank you.
I was, in your intro, you kind of explained that one of the issues with end user elicitation studies is some accessibility, and that kind of leads to a skew in some of the data.
Yep.
And in your analysis, you specifically mentioned that there's more of a focus on that your tool made it so that it was more accurate. Did any of your analysis focus on how this made it more accessible?
Not in this work,
Okay.
no, yeah. But it is sort of accessible in the sense that if you want to run an elicitation study with a specific group of users that are unable to come to your lab, it is more accessible that way.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. You mentioned about the representativeness of
Yes.
in-person studies. Do you have a handle on how representative the Amazon Turk volunteers were? And a linked question, I guess, is these studies, presumably as people internalise particular symbols and common things in society, there will be perhaps bias towards one or the other. And how does that work, I guess, in relation to sort of sampling bias?
Yeah, so there is work on Mechanical Turk itself and sort of crowd work and how accessible that is, and unfortunately it is not very accessible to all kinds of participants, so like blind participants and things like that. But our tools sort of, we use Mechanical Turk for this paper specifically just to see if the approach is possible. But you can, it is platform independent, so that URL can be directly sent to users of any variety.
We still have 3.5 minutes for questions. I have a very silly question, so we probably shouldn't let me ask it. All right. I'll ask my silly question. So, you presented an example with the 2 trash cans earlier on, and I noticed that they're both clearly trash cans, but one of them is 3-dimensional, the other one is 2-dimensional. And so, do aspects like that come into play in any way?
Oh yes, definitely. So there is one criticism of like the elicitation study process itself is sometimes when researchers are analyzing the results, some biases get into play, which is why our crowd census work sort of leaves that to a crowd of people, and you get a large number of people voting on what is similar and what is not similar. So we take that out.
How hard is it, do you think, to use your tool if we were to just download it right now and try to create a new elicitation study of some kind?
I would say not that hard, but just use a desktop. Yeah, it's still a research platform.
Hi, Luca McKay, Purdue University. It looked like from your design that it would be used to more crowdsource general icons and such.
Sure.
Could it be used to crowdsource more specific stuff as well?
Specific stuff, how?
Like more specific icons, even though they might not fit into the general categories that would then be moved on later.
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question.
I'll ask later.
Okay, let's link up after the talk. We'll talk about it.
Let's thank our speaker.